haven't met now since November of last year. So I've got a challenge question for anybody, including you on Skype. What was the last thing we studied? I was kind of surprised because I forgot actually.
Jeremiah.
Well, close, yeah. Well, Lamentations, right? Yeah, Lamentations. And so I thought that we had finished the book, but we have one more chapter to go. So I'm going to finish that up today, and then we're going to move into Ezekiel. All right. So if you remember the book of Lamentations, and I'm not going to review it here because the notes are on the website, but we have arrived at the last chapter of the book of Lamentation, which is chapter 5. And this final chapter of the book, and the book this chapter is only 22 verses, and just hold that in your mind for a second. That number should mean something to you. But it's 22 verses long, and it may have been written somewhat later in the exile, after all of the ransacking had taken place, and all of the moving of people and goods, and all of the things that happened settled down, and these people were just living their lives day by day in Babylon under the captivity. So at that point, it may have been simply a final heart-wrenching plea for mercy, as Jeremiah, who wrote this book, considers the still smoldering ruins of Solomon's temple, which was the final thing when everything was taken and the city was ransacked and the temple was taken and ransacked, and of course the city itself, the city of Jerusalem. As I was looking into this, there's a gentleman named William Sanford Lasor, Lasor, and he was professor emeritus of the Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. He died in 1991, but his book lives on, and he actually put in his book a survey of the Old Testament book that he wrote, or he co-authored, chapter 5, and he said, and I'm quoting here, "The sharp pain of defeat had dulled into the chronic ache of captivity." So this is where they are. I mean, we looked at Lamentations, and they chronicles, and we went through the agony, the continuous pain and agony of being pretty much beaten down and taken, and then you see they go back, the city's destroyed, the love of your life if you're Israel, and especially Judah, right? Because Israel was already ransacked by Assyria, but the temple is gone. Everything is taken. Everything is gone, and there's nothing. And now you are there, and there's something worse that's coming too as you're there. But this is where they are. That all that has now gone by, and their hope of going back is waning. It's waning. They're just living their lives daily under captivity, just day by day. Just like being in jail on a lifetime sentence. After a while, you settle in and you realize this is it. And, your hope is dashed, right? So, but we'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. But let's get back to the actual construct of chapter 5. So we noted in the beginning of our study of Lamentation that it is called, or it is one of those books or pieces of the Bible, and that is called an acrostic. And where it's a poem, and it's built around the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's a number of books like that, Psalm like that too, Psalm 119. So the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, beginning with Aleph and ending in Tav. Lamentations chapters 1 and 2 consist of 22 stanzas. The first word of each begins with the appropriate letter of the alphabet in the original Hebrew. But chapter 5 does not map into the Hebrew letters at all, although there are 22 verses, and that's what I was saying to think about before. It could be considered so it's not necessarily an acrostic, it could be considered representative of the 22-letter alphabet because of their number. Now, what I'm sure others have done, and I have not done it, and I'm not going to, but what you could do is you could probably sit down and research it and to see the cadence of each of those verses, right? And see how it maps into the full meaning of the Hebrew alphabet. Now remember, those of you who were in my Revelation Bible study years ago, I did that with the book of Revelation. And it really, it floated my boat because I had heard about it being that way. And then when I was researching to actually do the study, I was bringing tears to my eyes so often because it is amazing when you look at the Hebrew alphabet, and you know this, the meaning behind each letter. It's not just like we have our alphabet. It's more akin to the ideograms in the Chinese language or in the Korean language or the one of those Asian languages where a symbol has so much depth to it. Well, Hebrew is the same way. So it's amazing. And again, that just proves the veracity of Scripture and that God did write it. There's no possible way. When you look at the construct of the Hebrew language, which God created, that I believe when the world was of one language before the Tower of Babel, that was the language that was the only language that was there. And then you map that, and God actually maps a story, history, and then documents it from all these different people across all this time into a book, and you can make acrostics out of it. To me, that just, there's no end to the depth of God's command over everything, and it's marvelous to Christians anyway. It's just another, I don't know if you could use it as an apologetic. You might be able to take some people who are scholarly, right, who are not Christian. Matter of fact, they might be scholarly and be against Christianity, like even Jews who are scholars, like rabbis, and you might even be able to use that as an apologetic. I don't know. But I'm just saying it's all there for use in bringing to people or yourself. But anyway, so verses 19 and 20 of chapter 5 are themselves, though, a mini-acrostic used to express the highest praise for Yahweh, the Lord or God, in the entire book, followed by a tentative but hopeful cry for help. And this, to me, when I found this and I was looking into it, it follows that cadence of the excitement and the horror and of being taken captive and the destruction of the city and the temple. This is over a period of years, and then settling into the day by day, captivity, just life under captivity. So Aleph to Kaf, the first half of the alphabet, and Lamed to Tav, which is the second half of the Hebrew alphabet, are represented here. So A through K. A, thou, O Lord, you rule forever. And this is talking to God. The first half here is talking to God's sovereignty. So it says, you, O Lord, you rule forever. And K, the midpoint, your throne is from generation to generation. So they're here admitting and rehearsing the fact that God is sovereign. And he is still in total control of them, their situation, and everything. And that's something we obviously need to know too, no matter what happens. But then it goes into the second half of the alphabet, which is based on the concept of, but O Lord, do not abandon us. And then it asks the question, in L, which is the second half, L through Z, basically, what we would say L through Z. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so long? So you can see there's that hope being dashed. And, we can feel like that too. And what's coming on this nation, what we see is coming. It's been coming for a long time and it never stops, right? But even us in our personal lives, sometimes we feel God, where are you? Will you abandon me forever? Have I sinned so greatly? I've asked those questions before. Thankfully, I know God a lot better now. And my life is drawn so closer to him because of those times in the past that I definitely don't have to ask those questions much anymore. And I think that's just maturity. So you've all gone through that as well. But in general, the loud and doleful cry in the language of the book drops to a whisper in chapter 5. And really, it's sort of like a brooding. Some ancient Bible versions even call this chapter of Lamentations the prayer of Jeremiah. So this is almost like a prayer sitting down, almost like giving up. Almost like it, just like settling in, saying, okay. So let's read the last chapter in Lamentations, thinking about it being in this context and the prayer of Jeremiah. I'm going to start in verse 1, of course, and this is in the Amplified Version. O Lord, remember what has come upon us. Look and see our reproach, our national disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to foreigners. We have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows. We have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are worn out. There is no rest for us. We have given the hand as a pledge of fidelity and submission to Egypt and to Assyria to get enough bread. Our fathers sinned, and we are no more. If it is we who have carried their sin. Both forefathers and sons are responsible for the disasters that have come to Jerusalem. Remember, they say the sons of the fathers will be visited upon the children. This generation was equally deserving of punishment. And by the way, another case study in that is the 40-year sojourn on the way to the Promised Land. That was because God made all of them suffer that whole traversing of that whole winded route to Canaan, because he wanted to wait for that generation who didn't believe his promises to die off. So here you have children who are going to inherit that land, but they have to travel and sometimes need water and be moving and never settled. And as they're growing, they're seeing their parents get older. Some of them are getting sickly, and they're watching them die. And then finally they inherit the Promised Land, but look at all that they were subject to when God could have taken them on a straight route. But it's for the same reason. The punishments have to fall the way they are, and that's just the way it is, and they know it. So they're kind of rehearsing this here. In verse 8, the servants rule over us. There is no one to rescue us out of their hand. This is a real lamentation. This is like sitting there saying there is no hope. We get our bread at the risk of our lives, because of the sword of the Arabs in the wilderness, who may attack if we go out to harvest the crop. So you can't even go out and get food in safety. This is life under captivity. This is life.
It sounds like it's the same way it's going to happen.
Yeah, sure. Have you ever noticed that not only that, but it keeps happening to Israel the same way?
Yeah.
God uses the same thing. And you notice a lot of times, if they're not taken captivity, right, they're under siege in their own land. Where you have the armies build ramparts around the walls of the city, and they sit there and wait, so they can't go out to get their food, and they starve, and they started eating their own children. Remember, It's the same tactic. Same tactic. So, verse 10: our skin is as hot as the heat of an oven, because of the burning heat of the fever of famine. They've ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Princes were hung by their hands. Elders were not respected. Young men worked at the grinding mill, and boys fell staggering under loads of wood. Elders are gone from the gate, young men from their music. The joy of our hearts is ended. Our dancing has been turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Our honor is covered with dust. Woe to us. Why? For we have sinned. Okay, it's good that you admit it, but you still have to take the punishment because you didn't heed the warning, right? Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes are dim. As for Mount Zion, which lies desolate, right? It's all been ransacked. Foxes and the jackals prowl over it. And I just want to make a point here. You remember I said this, and this is history, right? Just before God readied the land to receive the people in the 1800s, we've talked about that, right? Mark Twain wrote about his travels, and he traveled, and he said almost verbatim what it says here: "It's not fit for man or jackal."
Yeah.
I don't. To me, there are no coincidences. What was planted in his mind to pen that, and this is it. Also, if you look at this, right? If you look at Psalm, I think what Psalm is it now? Is it? Oh, which is, I forget which Psalm. Maybe you'll remember which Psalm it is, but it's the one where it says, "Our captives in Babylon commanded us to sit by the river and sing a song of Zion." I forget what Psalm it was in, but you know what I'm talking about. So, you could see this is written all over. This is the truth, and this is exactly what God allows to happen, does happen, and this is how they were putting up with it, or being made to put up with it. But here is this last part of this hopeful thing, this kind of thing. This is like hope. So that was verse 18. But verse 19, just before the end of this book, the end of the chapter and the end of this book. But, and whenever I see but, if it comes on the heels of something bad, that means something good. But God, right? But if it comes on the heels of something good, but, then it's pretty bad. So the word but here is going to bring something good, because it's on the heels of all of this hardship. And it says in verse 19, "But you, O Lord, reign forever." You see that's sort of the acrostic part of it. "Your throne endures from generation to all generations." Then it says, on that last part, "Why do you forget us forever?" When God never said he would forget them forever. Matter of fact, God's promises all over the place is that Israel would never be forgotten because, and only because, for his name's sake will he ensure their survival, even the remnant of them. But this is the way they feel. Why do you forsake us so long? And again, you look at the Psalms. The Psalms are full of lamentations like this for different reasons, right? And also full of hope like that too. So why do you forsake us for so long? And it is a long time. 70 years of captivity is a long time. Return us to you. You notice it's not even saying return us to Jerusalem, although that's what they want. Return us so that we can rebuild the city and the temple, which is eventually going to come. But look at this. Most important to them, even through all of this, is to return us to you, O Lord, so that we may be restored. So they know that there is no hope, but it's still for them other than still being in the Lord.
They were expecting God to do the work.
That's right, and he needs to. They know he's the only one who can.
But, it looks like they were expecting God to do the work without them doing much work.
Well, I think what they're saying here is that they know that there's going to be work, no matter what. I mean, if you're going to rebuild something, unless God just puts it there, which he usually doesn't, it's going to take work. But they're saying that they can't even begin to even think of doing anything until God decides to restore them. So they have to be brought back to God first. It's sort of like in our lives too, right? It's the same thing. So, no, you didn't lose your connection. I can still hear you.
There you are.
Okay. Did you black out or something?
It just froze.
Oh, okay. So it says, why do you forsake us for so long? Verse 21. Return us to you, O Lord, so that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Right? Unless you have utterly rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us. So you see there's that caveat there, which they know in their heart of hearts is not true. But when you're that low in hope, right, that can very easily fall into abandon. And that's a dangerous place to be. This is how low they were, right? And I know some of us have been there. So finally for chapter 5, you may remember that we did in the other chapters, we did a parallel between the conditions that of your punishment if you fail in Deuteronomy. Remember when the second law was given? And if you do this, this will happen. If you do this good, you'll get this. Okay. Well, Lamentations maps into that pretty well. And I did that for the previous chapters. Well, I did the same thing here for chapter 5, excuse me. So I'm just going to read those comparisons real quick. So in chapter 5, verse 2, in the second half of the verse, it says, our houses were given to aliens. Remember I read that just now? And it says the warning, the direct parallel warning in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 30 is, you shall build a house, but you shall not live in it. God ain't kidding. The second one in here is chapter 5 and verse 5 of Lamentations. There is no rest for us. Right? Very pointed. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 65 it says, and among those nations you will find no rest. Boom. That also talks about the diaspora too. I mean, it's the same thing over and over again, right? Lamentations chapter 5 verse 10. The burning heat of our famine. Remember what I just said, our skin is on fire because of the burning heat of our famine. And it says in verse 28, chapter 28 and verse 24 in Deuteronomy, the rain, R-A-I-N, the rain of your land and the powder will be powder and dust, basically. So, verse 5, chapter 5, verse 11 of Lamentation, the women of Zion were ravished. Pretty bad. And in chapter 28, verse 30, they were warned, the nations who will take you if you don't, if you disobey, who shall have no respect for the old, for the young, for the women, for the children. It's like you will be just chattel to them. You'll be nothing to them. So it's not like there's no parallel warnings here. Chapter 5 and verse 12, the elders were not respected. Deuteronomy 28, verse 50, who shall have no respect for the old. And by the way, you ever notice how our society is like that today?
Of course.
And I'm starting to feel it now. I just hit 60 years old, and my buddy Jesse's hitting 60 years old on Thursday?
Thursday.
Yeah, good luck with that. Good luck with that. I already did it yesterday. And finally, chapter 5 and verse 18, foxes prowl in Zion. Remember, I just said that there's nothing there but foxes and jackals. Chapter 28 and verse 26. And your carcasses shall be food to all birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth, and there shall be no one to frighten them away. It'll be desolate. And that's what it says. So I feel like I'm about to cry, so I'm going to end the study of the book of Lamentations. And now let's move on to the next book, which will start now, and we're not going to go too far into it. The book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel. It's a big, big thing to tackle. But isn't it interesting? And I'm not going to go off on left field, so don't worry. You don't have to worry about your rooster crowing. But think of, I mean, what is it? I know I'm thinking of a lot these days. Isaiah 17, of course, Damascus being flattened, the burden of Damascus. But look at how much Ezekiel 38 and 39, right? By the way, that's the battle of Gog and Magog taking over the land, okay?
That's
but
where you're going to cry.
Huh? What'd you say?
Where are you going to cry?
I'm going to cry. Yeah. It's amazing how quickly it's coming. I mean, it's right at the doorstep. Say again? Jesse?
No, Susan was saying something to me.
Oh, okay. And, but if you also look at it, the chapters just preceding those, chapters, I think 36, 37, somewhere around there, it talks about the valley of dry bones. Mm-hmm. And what is that all about? The restoration of Israel in her land, right? And God, but coming in unbelief until sinew and bone. I mean, the sinew comes upon the bone and muscle, and then they get hydrated with the Spirit, and that's what's coming afterwards. And they start to believe. And look, by the way, how many of them are coming to Christ now anyway. But as a remnant, I mean, this is a phenomenal book. And you know what? We could take a very long time just doing this book, but look how long it takes me to do anything else. So I can't get into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to dwell on that. And wouldn't it be ironic is that as we go through this book, with all that's swirling around now with North Korea and Russia and Syria and everything getting so close right now, if that started to come to pass as we're studying this book, just saying. Just saying. But we'll see. Anyway, so in the midst of Jeremiah's ministry back in history, the prophet Ezekiel is prepared by God and appears on the scene at the same time. So now you have three major, pretty much contemporaries here, right, for this whole captivity thing. You have Jeremiah, you have Daniel, and you have Ezekiel, right? And they all interface. Because you may remember that in the book of Daniel, Daniel was actually studying the book of Jeremiah. And then knew that the 70-year captivity was up. Almost. And then you know the rest of that story. The major prophecy of the end with the Antichrist coming. So that's it. And so Ezekiel's ministry now starts at about 592 BC. Some interesting facts I'd like to prelude a book with where I can. What I like to do is the name Ezekiel means strength of God. Interesting. And it's fitting because Ezekiel would be called to a life of hardship and great difficulties during his life and his ministry. Now think of this, and we're going to see this more. Ezekiel had a special kind of ministry where he wasn't just speaking as a prophet for the most part. He was actually play acting. God had him do certain things, which we're going to get into, and I'm sure most of us know these, that he had to physically do, which some of them were pretty abhorrent. Some of them were very difficult. So it wasn't just a speaking prophet. He lived these things as a witness. It's very interesting how that worked out. But I digress, as I say. We'll get into more of that later. Ezekiel started as a priest who was then called into a prophetic ministry. By the way, Jeremiah and he had that same kind of background. Jeremiah started as a priest and was called as a prophet. And he was called, he did that change into a prophetic ministry at about the age of 30, about 5 years after being carried away captive with everybody else into the second deportation. Remember, there were two deportations to Babylon, and then finally the city was destroyed. But anyway, so about 5 years after being carried away into the second deportation into Babylon, so this is now 597 BC. Okay, so you see they're all contemporaries in the same place. Ezekiel and Daniel were both taken into Babylonian captivity, and of course we know Jeremiah was there too. So you see how they intertwine. And for me, to know these little factoids about these prophets helps understand and interpret what their books are like better they interface, because they share some of the same history, but they have different points of view, yet under the same prompting of the Holy Spirit to write to their people and then to us. But anyway, Daniel was taken in the first siege, and Ezekiel in that second siege. And this took place 11 years after Nebuchadnezzar finally overthrew Jerusalem. So 70, I mean, there's a lot that happened in that 70 years. It's unbelievable. Ezekiel, Daniel, and John were 3 prophets that spoke outside of their native land. That's another little factoid that I learned as I was studying, and I think about that. And they each wrote of an apocalypse. Interesting. As prophet too, and within the population of exiles in Babylon, and that's key to remember. When they were in exile, they were not only amongst their people, but they were amongst those pagans. They lived together. They lived and worked and did everything together. Right? He was tasked by God to remind them, his people, of the national sins that brought on that 70 years of captivity in that land, as he also reinforced their faith with solid predictions of the future national restoration to Israel. Now, there was a problem, which we're going to see in a little while here, about false prophets in that amongst them as well, like we have today, right? But the point is in the captivity there were false prophets among them. So you see that Ezekiel and Daniel, but mostly right now we're talking about Ezekiel. Ezekiel was able to witness to those Babylonians at the same time, and while he was doing these play acting, the Babylonians saw him too. They probably thought he was really crazy, because if the Israelites thought he was crazy, imagine what the Babylonians thought of him doing all these things. But just think about that, right? When we see anybody else witnessing amongst the Gentiles, even today, we're called kooks, we're called whatever we're called, right? But it's a witness. And remember Daniel, right? Think of this as a side note. When the captivity ended, remember, Daniel did not go back home.
Right.
He stayed. And history holds that he migrated up toward the Caspian Sea, where it interfaces up at the north part of Iran. And there, he must have been teaching those good old Gentiles, because it was from that area the Magi knew from teachings, which go back to Daniel. They knew this special sign in this heavens, that the Messiah was born, the King of the world. And then they traveled 2 years. That's why Jesus was 2 years old. Now, I've said that before, but think of the background, history of all of this happening. And it's marvelous. It's just marvelous to see how God worked through these men, not only for their people, but for others. And it kind of put Israel to shame, when the sign of Messiah came, and most of them wouldn't even see it. And these pagans, who were Zoroastrians, coming from a foreign land, pretty close to Babylon, who traveled 2 years to see the Messiah and bring him gifts. And they were kingmakers. They were wealthy. But anyway, that's that for that. So he not only prophesied of their future national restoration and reinforced their faith while they were still in this lulling captivity, he further prophesied of the coming future glory of the millennial kingdom. And that's a key point, right? A lot of Christians don't even really understand that or believe that. But the millennial kingdom with Israel as the head of the nations. How much have we talked about that? And how many Christians do you think, in your general walk as a Christian in church, wherever you go to church, right? How many people even think of that? Do they know what's going to happen after everybody's looking for the Antichrist or everybody's looking for the tribulation? Okay, great. But does anybody even think about what happens after that? Why? What happens? Who's here? Who does what? This is all prophesied through here, and this is a ray of hope. Because think of the irony here. Not only is Israel in captivity and in strict bondage, but they're suffering, as we saw in the book of Lamentations, severely, right? And then they've had the diaspora after that. They've always been slapped around. But Daniel says that the tribulation will be the end of the transgressions, right? It will be the end of the judgment. And then there's the promise of, well, what happens after that? Well, don't worry, Israel, because God has a plan. Jesus is going to bring in that kingdom, which you thought he was going to bring in, not then, but in the future, in the New Testament period when Jesus was around. But the point is, this coming kingdom is not only going to come, but Ezekiel was telling them that Israel, believe it or not, will not only be out of captivity and back in her land, but she will be the head of the nations, and the Messiah will rule from a temple in that land. Now imagine being in captivity. You know your city's destroyed, very little hope of going back. Your temple is gone. You don't know the future. You don't know anything about Cyrus or going back. You don't know anything about all of that, the Medes and the Persians and all that stuff. You don't know that yet. And all you hear is this guy coming to you and saying to you, there's not only is there going to be a temple, but your true Messiah, the real Messiah, is going to be there, ruling and reigning, and you will be the head of the nations, and everything will flow to and from you. By the way, which was supposed to happen, and they didn't do it as God's people, through whom God gave us the oracles of God called the Bible. They're going to be forced, basically, to do and be what they were supposed to be since Abraham's time, but they never did it. That's why the church had to come, right? So by their failures, we are saved. But just think of the import of that. That to me is phenomenal. We're going to wrap up shortly here. He, of course, wrote the book of Ezekiel during his ministry, 593 to 571 BC, which, of course, is the topic here. At this point, it is fitting to review a few basic suppositions that the Bible is based on. And I'm going to review this. You've heard this before. We'll wrap up with this. But we have to set the context of these books, especially these major books. We should set the context of all of them, which we try to do. That's part of an overview. But let's talk about this. First, and again, this is going to be repetition, but I want you to roll this around before we meet again. First, the Bible only speaks about nations as they come into contact with Israel. So, which leads me to the second thing. It addresses only three people groups. There are only three people groups in this world, right? You see all these different people groups named in the scriptures, and then throughout history, there's only three people groups in the world, and that's it. The Bible's very simple when it comes to that. The Israelites, right, which is the Jews and Judah and all of the 12 tribes. Christians, and everybody else who's neither. The Gentiles, right? Now, by the way, that group of Gentiles, which is profane, also includes things that Christians don't like to talk about, like the Nephilim when they were here, right? The Anakim there, you know who I'm talking about. The Rephaim and the Anakim and the giants, King Og and all them. I can't think of the names right now. I don't know. Let me just shut this here off here. I'm having a brain spasm. But all of them, whether they're purely evil, whether they know they're evil, whether they intend to destroy Israel or the Christian or not, whether they just love Buddha and they just want to have flowers in their hair, they're all Gentiles, and they're all spoken of in one accord. Now, why do we have to say this? Because although, of course, all the books of the Bible are applicable in its truths to all human beings who ever lived or ever will live on this earth, right? There is a specific book of the Bible dedicated the general historicity, if you will, of each of those three people groups, right? And we know what those are. These books offer a general overview of the past and future, the total general overarching plan of God for each of these three people groups as they interact with each other and with Israel, okay? And God's timeline, which is basically, remember, there's a chess game going on here. There's Mystery Babylon, the black pieces, and then there's God's economy, and all the people who are in each of those throughout history being driven by God and also being driven by Satan, right? Okay. So what are those books and what do they mean? The book of Daniel is dedicated to the Gentile timeline. That statue of Nebuchadnezzar is all the Gentile governments, right? Okay, until the end, throughout all the 6,000 years. The book of Revelation, dedicated to the Christian timeline and the church, which actually exits in the rapture, because after chapter 3, the church is no longer mentioned for the rest of Revelation. We know that. But it shows the end time and what's happening with the judgments. But it also has the 7 letters written to the 7 churches, which is really a general letter to the church. We each fall into one of those 7 buckets, and we change buckets sometimes as we grow in our Christian walk, right? So that's that. For that, finally, we have Ezekiel, which is the dedicated book for the Israelite timeline, and that's what I wanted to focus on because that's what we're talking about here. So to me, it's much simpler to put the Bible in its simplest context. The Bible really is not that complicated if you put it into its simplest context and its simplest constructs. and then add everything on top of that, and you can compartmentalize it better. That's the wrong word to use. You should never compartmentalize the scriptures, but you know what I'm saying. You can know why and who and how much easier if you simplify the Bible in its terms. That's all I'm saying, and that's pretty much in life too. But anyway, but this book, being rather complex and full, is about 65% prophetically oriented. And that's, of course, the thrust that floats my boat. But look at all of the things he offered to Israel during the captivity of a forward-looking view of their history, ending with them, with not only a temple, but Messiah being there, them being there, and them being the head of all the nations. So, but this book is much, much more worthy of our study than just trying to figure out Gog and Magog. And that's where I'm not going to really go into that much right now. I'm not going to go into it all. We've seen that. And we'll wrap up with this. It's not that much to study of that in the consortium of the nations that will be led in the soon coming invasion of Israel. That's the focal point most people think about, right? But back in the 40s, we were alive back then, and we saw Israel becoming a nation again, we would probably think of Ezekiel 36 and 37, or wherever the dry bones are. But that's really the case, right? But think of this. This laser focus on Gog and Magog and the consortium of nations and the attendant technology and the modern day stuff and situation that would take to bring all of these nations and their leaders into alignment, which we are right now, right? It wasn't even possible more than 70 years ago. You have to have nuclear capability, which was developed really by the Nazis. By the way, just at the time when Satan knew that Israel was getting ready to become a nation again, right? See how all this technology came up? This evil technology that could be used for either or both. But without modern technology, which really started in the 40s in earnest, right, with the transistor, nuclear capability, lasers, all of the things that we take for granted now, which is the basis of the end times technology, without that stuff, you can't possibly align the nations and get them ready for a full-fledged invasion, where Israel, as it says in Ezekiel, is going to be burning the weapons of the defeated armies on her own soil for 7 years. Which puts another thought into this. If we know that that's a literal 7 years, and it is, where does that place the invasion of Gog and Magog in context of the tribulation, which we know is 7 years? It's probably going to be before. Which means, well, we don't know that, but that's something we're going to speculate on later. Because the timing of the rapture, which most people think, and I did too until I started really thinking about this, which is what I'm trying to bring out here, and we'll end with this. Think about this. Most people think the rapture may be even a new concept to some people, but everybody's talking about it. There's plenty of argument against it now. It's like this focal point. Like, people want to see the Antichrist. You don't want to see the Antichrist. You don't need to be purified in the tribulation, church. That's beside the point. But think of this, right? What the scriptures make it basically say, without putting a timeline wrapper around it, that the Antichrist cannot come on the scene until when? Until the Holy Spirit is taken out of the way. He can't. It's impossible. Now, we know that the Holy Spirit dwells in us, that he's the restrainer, okay? But we see evil trying to belly up and bubble up, and it can't quite do it until we're gone. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we know that whoever's here will know at the time who the Antichrist is, and it's written for them who are becoming saints in those days, in the tribulation, who is left behind. When that Antichrist reinforces an already on the books covenant, right? Which, by the way, Trump is saying he's going to do. And Kushner, Jared Kushner, is the Jew, the Hasidic Jew married to his daughter. This guy's starting to gain a lot of power. A lot of power in the background. Is he the one that's going to come up? Because he's going to be one that Trump is going to send to really start putting this peace deal together. By the way, as a side note, did you know that Mahmoud Abbas is coming over here in May to visit the White House? Is this the beginning of something that Trump himself said he was going to do after his election, but before he got inaugurated? He said he was going to be the one to bring a peace deal because he's the deal maker. He's the one also who's going to bring the embassy, American embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He's got Kushner, who's an Hasidic Jew who married his daughter, who converted to Judaism as the main thrust. And I saw a part of an interview when Netanyahu was visiting with Trump. And Kushner was in the audience, and I saw the clip where he says they're talking about Jared Kushner being the ambassador, whatever the heck is going to be there. And Netanyahu said about Kushner, and it says, I said something like, And I don't think I have to tell everybody how well we know each other. Are you kidding me? But anyway, so that's the thing. But think of this. So if that's the case, but we know that there are certain things that have to happen that have timelines around them, like this invasion of Israel in 7 years where they'll be burning the weapons and burying the bodies. There'll be people under full-time employment for 7 months burying bodies. That's what it says in Ezekiel 39. It says it verbatim. Okay. So if we're raptured, that's not going to be the next day the Antichrist is going to come around. It could be that we're going to be raptured, and it could be weeks, months, or years before the tribulation starts. You see what I'm saying? If you look at the cadence of what happens, now the strong delusion still has to come. What if there's a nuclear exchange that takes out a bunch of people on this earth, and so it's masking the fact that so many of us are gone, and maybe the invaders are going to come down and be able to come up out of the pit at that time too.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How could they be burning the war equipment? I mean, to burn it, do they have to be made in wood?
No.
Because
good question.
It's metal. It's
Good question. And here's the answer that I come up with, and not only me, because it seems obvious. And here's the answer. The Bible is written in the context. Say again?
What was the question?
The question from Felicia was, how is it that Israel's going to be burning the weapons that are on the land when Russia and the allied nations come in and invade her, and they defeat her they defeat the enemy in their land, and they're going to be left with all these hundreds and thousands of dead bodies and all of the armaments and all of the weapons that they came with, that they're going to use them for fuel for 7 years. So, and that's what it states.
It should be made in wood.
Well, it can't be made in wood. But see, the thing is, it can't be made in wood because you'd have to have so much wood to burn. I mean, this is going to supply all or most of the power requirements of a technological Israel that's rebuilding after being invaded for 7 years. Wood ain't going to do that. So, what I think the Bible is saying, and think of this, okay? Because especially if you look at the book of Revelation and you look at parts of Daniel, the Bible's written by the minds of men, inspired by the Holy Spirit, but only they only can write in context of what they know to be true at that day. That's why when you look at the scriptures, right, it names nations. You have to know history. You have to go back, like when it says God and Magog, or it says like Persia. Well, you have to understand that they did not know that Iran is Persia. They're not going to know the name change. They don't know the geography changes, right? So what I'm saying to you is it's the same thing with this. With nuclear capability, okay, the energy density, lithium-ion batteries, right? The energy density is that they will be able to use this to power, right? Radiate, however it is that this, right? So you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand.
The technology that they're going to have, that they're going to leave there when they're defeated, Israel will be able to use that technology to power their society. That's what it means. Anyway, I think we'll stop here.